4 long years before I took office, the last administration allowed the cartels and their operatives.
4:25 a.m. The Gulf was mirror flat, and the watch team on the USS Tripoli was running a routine patrol when the ANSPY-6 radar threw an anomaly across the Combat Information Center. The first sentence of the report was a single blinking line. 3 contacts, no AIS, moving in tight formation at roughly 22 knots. The ship's CIC went from routine to red in seconds, operators swapping screens, thermal feeds painting the decks of those targets in harsh white, rows of industrial drums, palletized cases, and what looked like gun mounts. The data did not fit a fishing run. Analysts cross-checked electro-optical tracks with SIGINT snippets and found deliberate attempts to mask signatures, a basic form of electronic camouflage that briefly fooled lighter systems, but not an Aegis-class ship. The preliminary estimate from the forensic lab was blunt and immediate. Enough precursor chemicals on board to produce approximately 6.5 metric tons of fentanyl. The math translated into a human scale the audience understands without melodrama. A catastrophic capacity to harm. Command moved into Condition 1. A single message flowed up the chain. Activate Operation Iron Wave. That order did not arrive as rhetoric. It was a checklist. Weapons ready, aviation on deck, boarding teams briefed, ISR nodes linked to the fleet and to Washington. In the space between heartbeat and decision, the Tripoli's systems reacquired the contacts and held them in the crosshairs. This was no longer a seizure. It was the opening gambit of a clash. But were those 3 ships only a trafficking run? Or were they bait for something far worse? Stay with us. And make sure to like and subscribe, because Operation Iron Wave is just getting started. They weren't smugglers. They were bait, and the Navy had just taken it. At 4:47 a.m., the sea lit up. USS Tripoli's Combat Information Center locked firing solutions in less than a second. The ship's Aegis grid calculating trajectories before the human eye could blink. A single AGM-114R Hellfire burst from the deck launcher, streaking low across the black water at Mach 1.3. When it struck the lead vessel, the blast tore the night open. A white-orange sphere, hull plates flipping skyward, shockwaves hammering the Gulf. The first target was gone before its crew could reach their weapons, but the other 2 didn't run. The second cartel boat turned broadside and answered with a burst from a 30mm cannon, tracers skipping off the waves. The Tripoli's sensors recorded the impacts, shallow angles, minimal damage, but proof that this was no drug runner improvisation. It was a coordinated defense. From the carrier's aft deck, an MH-60R Seahawk rose through the smoke, its rotors biting into the humid air. It banked hard left, released a ripple of Hydra 70 rockets, and the second vessel vanished in a roar of fragmentation. The third ship kept fighting. Marines and RHIBs pushed through the debris field under covering fire from the Seahawk's door guns. Automatic bursts answered them. Disciplined, aimed fire, not chaos. Inside the hold, they found hardened steel crates, encryption drives, and maps of U.S. energy routes labeled in Russian script. One operator looked up to see a small drone lifting off the stern, transmitting video of the battle to somewhere far beyond the horizon. Veracruz, intelligence would say later. By 5:18 a.m., the Tripoli reported 2 vessels destroyed, 1 captured. The Gulf was silent again, except for the hiss of burning fuel and the thrum of the Seahawk circling above. Then the radar watch officer spoke. 6 new contacts, low altitude, high speed, approaching from the south. Infrared signature. Metallic. They weren't birds, they weren't missiles, they were something else entirely. If those 6 objects weren't scouts, but the opening strike of a new war, would Washington dare call it what it really was? The contacts kept coming. What the radar first mistook for scouts were, in fact, the first wave of an attack. Within minutes, the Gulf horizon turned alive with motion. At 7:05 a.m., 6 metallic signatures broke from Cuban airspace, racing north at 780 kilometers per hour and flying barely 12 meters above the water, too low for ordinary radar to hold a lock. On board USS Tripoli, the thermal display pulsed white-hot. 6 drones, delta-winged, each roughly the size of a small car and carrying 50 kilograms of shaped explosives. The order to engage came instantly. The ship's Phalanx CIWS roared to life, its 6 barrels spinning to a blur, hurling 4,500 rounds every second into the humid air. The first drone evaporated in a streak of fire. The second broke apart mid-turn, scattering shards across the waves, but 4 others slipped through the defensive wall and dropped altitude toward the Texas coast. F-35 B Lightning IIs scrambled from the carrier group to intercept. One missile flashed out, a perfect hit, but the formation had already split. On radar, it looked like chaos. In reality, it was choreography. These drones were being flown by someone who understood American defenses, someone testing every gap between sensors and the curvature of the Earth. Seconds later, one vanished from every scope. When it reappeared, it was too late. The detonation at Galveston Bay Refinery measured 2.3 kilotons, bright enough to turn the dawn white and then blood red. Shockwaves rolled inland, shattering windows 20 miles away. Across the coast, the Gulf Defense Grid jumped to condition crimson, the highest readiness level since 9/11. Civilian air traffic froze. Emergency bands filled with overlapping voices. For the first time in modern history, a non-state actor had struck U.S. soil with coordinated air power. Initial analysis was worse than expected. Recovered fragments bore Cyrillic engraving on the guidance chips and Chinese serial numbers on the sensor housings. The cartel had fielded technology built for battlefields, not smuggling routes. This wasn't organized crime anymore, it was organized warfare. In less than 15 minutes, the distinction between cartel and combatant disappeared, and somewhere south, inside a concrete bunker near Veracruz, a new launch sequence was already counting down. They had crossed a line. The blast at Galveston Bay and the dead weight of smoke over the Gulf answered the question posed hours earlier. This was no isolated attack. It was an act of war by proxy. Inside the Situation Room, the air tightened. Analysts fed imagery and SIGINT into a single common picture, while the president and defense leadership moved through a short, brutal checklist. There was no argument about intent, only a sequence of necessary actions, authorized strikes, clear legal authorities, and synchronized forces across sea, air, and special operations. Orders flowed down the chain with surgical speed. The carrier strike group in the northern Gulf was placed on immediate launch posture. Aegis cruisers readied Tomahawk cells, and long-range ISR platforms were tasked to maintain 24-hour overwatch. Special operations planners finalized insertion routes for Marine boarding teams and coordinated DEA handlers to secure evidence and prisoners once objectives were achieved. Communications were reduced to essential circuits. Radio silence would mask the approach and deny the enemy any warning. Everything was choreographed to minimize civilian risk while maximizing decisive effect, and every sensor and shooter was linked to the same timeline. At 11:40 a.m., with authorization in hand and forces in motion, Operation Iron Wave Phase 2 began. They moved like a shadow force. Under strict radio silence, 3 destroyers peeled away from the carrier screen and held a transit line 5 nautical miles off the Veracruz coast, engines throttled to reduce acoustic signature. 2 cyclonic RHIBS pushed forward at 30 knots, surfacing and plunging through a gray swell as Marines and plate carriers rode low and ready. Above them, an MQ-9 Reaper tracked at 30,000 feet, its EO/IR gimbals painting the ground in high definition and streaming coordinates back to the assault planners in near real time. DEA case officers rode aboard one of the ships with printed manifests and lists of known associates, feeding human intelligence into the tactical picture, while Navy electronic warfare suites swept the bands for hostile emissions. Sonar teams pinged for mines and surveyed the seabed. Small boats checked for submerged obstacles and fishing nets rigged as crude anti-boarding traps. Every movement was measured, RHIBS timed to the second, aerial assets on 3-minute orbit windows, and boarding teams rehearsed assault drills in the dark so that each action would be automatic. As the first RHIBs crossed the shallows, infrared showed heat signatures around a concealed compound, vent stacks, coolant exhaust, the mechanical pulse of active machinery. The approach had succeeded in maintaining surprise. The cartel's outer defenses did not register a coordinated warning until the Marines were within 600 meters of the beach. For a brief moment, the operation was a single, precise machine. Intelligence, maneuver, and firepower synchronized to one clock. They found the door by accident and by instruments. What looked like scrub and farmland from the air resolved into service roads and reinforced blast doors as Reaper feeds stitched mosaics together. Metal counterweights, ventilation trunks, and an access shaft pushed through bedrock like the mouth of an industrial animal. The entryway swallowed the RHIB's beam light and returned only a dull, mechanical echo. A buried complex, not a storehouse, not a warehouse, but a purpose-built command node. Inside, the scale became obvious. Corridors ran in grid patterns, walls lined with racks of battery modules and inverter banks, coolant lines stamped with Chinese manufacture marks snaked toward massive server rooms, and welded gantries supported launch canisters arranged for rapid UAV deployment. A maintenance bay held frames that were not jury-rigged toys but purpose-built airframes. Carbon composites, folding wings, avionics bays, fitted with circuit boards stamped in Cyrillic. Tactical logs on a seized tablet showed coordinated launch windows, encrypted handshakes to GPS and GLONASS, and a live telemetry feed that had streamed the earlier sea battle back to a control node. The cartel had not merely hidden drones in a shed. They had built a dispersed factory and a hardened node for command and control. More worrying, specialist teams found frequency sweepers and a small phased array emitter, enough to blind local radars and to attempt targeted jamming of a Tomahawk's guidance in the first wave. When a Reaper attempted to lock a launch rail, the feed momentarily skewed. Operators watched as telemetry snapped to noise, then bled back into view. The first real dogfight was not between pilots, but between packets of data and bursts of radio energy. Above ground, the sky responded. The launch rails spat wings into darkness. The new generation UAVs climbed steep, folded into attack profiles, and the air over Veracruz became a battlefield of machines. The airspace over Veracruz turned into a lattice of heat and steel. As the cartel's rails spat out a second wave of stout, needle-nosed UAVs, winged missiles that accelerated to 900 kilometers per hour on a short burn. Reapers and Navy strike fighters layered into intercept patterns. The initial exchanges were digital, as much as kinetic. Data links flickered. Radars sketched tracks, then lost them, and for a few violent minutes the sky was a chessboard of maneuvers. A surface salvo opened the kinetic phase. 3 destroyers on station sent the first Tomahawk flight downrange. One missile abruptly began to veer. Onboard analysts watched a cascade of telemetry that read like a denied prayer. Signal noise rose, inertial drift increased, and the missile's seeker hunted a false horizon. The phased array jammer in the compound had the range and power to induce a guidance anomaly. That first Tomahawk did not reach its intended bay. It splashed 20 kilometers short. The mistake cost time and forced an adjustment in execution. Command reacted instantly. Satellite relay switches were thrown, and control ceded to tiered satellite navigation. Military AEHF and inertial mid-course updates replaced the degraded GPS feed. The Tomahawk salvo pattern relocked, and 18 cruise missiles from 3 platforms outside Mexican waters corrected and resumed. sailing on altitudes and waveforms charted to punch through gaps in the jamming envelope. Their warheads were not theatrical monster bombs, but surgical tools. Subsonic, stealthy, and equipped with precise unitary and penetrating warheads calibrated to collapse reinforced roofs and crater launch pads without setting off the entire complex like a chain reaction. At 45,000 feet, a B-2 Spirit slipped along a night-painted route, a low, observable silhouette on a screen that looked like a smudge. The bomber released GBU-57A/B massive ordnance penetrators, bombs designed to punch through 8 meters of concrete and detonate within. The sensors on board the B-2 and the follow-on ISR network had mapped the facility's support grid. The MOPS fell through reinforced arches and into vaults that intelligence had labeled command and control nodes. When the penetrators went off, the sound was a distant, subterranean wrath. The concrete peeled, steel frames kinked, and a subterranean corridor collapsed in a wave of dust. Simultaneously closer in, MQ-9s and FA-18S, assisted by E-2D airborne radar, worked the periphery. The dogfight in the lower envelope was intense. Cartel UAVs, fast and small, used terrain masking and short-run accelerations to break radar locks. Reapers launched Hellfire-class missiles, while F-18S used their cannon and precision munitions to chop flight paths. One attacker skimmed across the water and struck a decoy buoy, detonating harmlessly, while another impacted a service building, trimming the complex's ability to re-raise waves. Electronic warfare teams aboard the destroyers emitted counterjams, creating windows where seekers could reacquire true targets. On the ground, the Marines felt the shock waves as punches landed. The initial breach team had forced an access shaft and flowed through service corridors, but they did not arrive to empty halls. Hardened spaces contained fighters, combatants with plate carriers, tactical comms, and trained reflexes who had been briefed to hold for relief. The firefight was brutal and close. Room to room, Marines used M27 IARS and M240S to suppress, while Grenadiers employed M203S to clear doorways and breathing space. In narrower passages, small drones, hand-launched scouts, scouted corners. Thermal images guided entry teams. The cartel's fighters responded with disciplined automatic fire and improvised explosive traps, then melted into secondary tunnels when overwhelmed. EOD teams moved like surgeons through the rubble and wiring. At the center of the node, they encountered 3 C4 charges wired to a programmed timer with a cascade trigger, designed to detonate the command vault if overrun. The charges were concealed in cabinets and beneath server racks, and one of the fuses was set to a countdown with mere seconds remaining when the team reached it. Procedures collapsed into muscle memory. Isolation, frequency sniff, counter voltage, and a manual cut sequence practiced on thousands of training simulations. For those minutes, the room seemed to stretch. One misplaced movement could have turned the entire cavern into a tomb. The EOD techs worked, breathing shallow, fingers steady, and they removed the threat with 7 seconds to spare. When they hit the command vault, what they found reframed the whole engagement. Racks of servers hummed in redundancy, bare fiber trunks fed external comms, and a bank of control consoles blinked with recent telemetry. The data stores contained encrypted manifests, launch logs, and network handshakes, evidence that the cartel had been operating a coordinated state-scale C2 loop. Specialist analysts on site began a forensic harvest as Marines continued to clear rooms and secure prisoners. Meanwhile, the surface picture continued to evolve as naval gunfire and air-delivered precision ordnance finished softening satellite nodes and redundant rails. Despite the violence, the assault remained disciplined. Rules of engagement were enforced to limit collateral damage. Medical teams staged evacuation corridors, and DEA handlers moved to secure evidence and prepare detainees for intelligence exploitation. The cartel's human losses were significant. Trained fighters captured or killed, launch infrastructure demolished, funding lines severed. Still, the price was not zero. Several U.S. wounded required medevac, and the echo of the fight would leave scars in local communities. Strategically, however, the coalition had achieved its objectives. The primary node was destroyed, secondary launch sites were neutralized, and the control network was disrupted. When the fires died and the dust settled, the tally was made. 33 hardened positions had been engaged or destroyed across the complex and its immediate satellite sites. Analysts logged 73 UAVs rendered inoperable, some shot down in the air, others disabled in their rails or ruined in collapsed bays. The financial estimate of direct losses, platforms, launch infrastructure, code repositories, and precursor stockpiles settled at roughly $2.8 billion. Most critically for Washington, intact evidence and captured hardware allowed immediate attribution. Firmware with Cyrillic signatures, procurement chains tracing to foreign brokers, and encrypted comms pointing to a transnational network that used narco-smuggling as cover for lethal capability proliferation. By the time the last boarding team moved back to the RHIBs, dawn had given way to a flat, gray noon. The submarinal hum of the strike group resumed a patrol cadence, and the airborne platforms peeled away, leaving space for local authorities and reconstruction teams. The operation had been costly in sheer tempo and in the tension it created worldwide, but it achieved the decisive objective. The cartel's Veracruz hub was no longer a launch pad. It was rubble, silent, and unable to coordinate. Yet before the final contaminant sweep, a systems engineer watching a captured server farm noticed a line in the dataset that did not conform. A sustained, low-bandwidth heartbeat routing through an offshore relay and into a set of apparently innocuous corporate servers. It suggested redundancy reaching farther than a single compound. The forensic lead annotated the log and flagged it for immediate uplink to the Pentagon. That small, humming line of code, buried in a wrecked machine room, would be the seed of a different battle, one fought not with shells and missiles, but with packets, subpoenas, and global cooperation. But when the debris cooled, and engineers began to connect the fragments of control that had driven the waves of violence, what they found beneath the concrete wasn't debris at all. It was a network, and it shook the Pentagon to its core. When the Veracruz compound went dark, most assumed it was over. But inside the Pentagon, screens still burned. Analysts traced the surviving data stream, and the map expanded far beyond Mexico into Dubai, Malaysia, and Belarus. It was no longer a cartel. It was a global network, an alliance of black markets and silent sponsors. Recovered servers revealed procurement lists for microchips, guidance modules, and encrypted radio systems, all routed through shell companies tied to foreign defense contractors. The narcotics trade had mutated into a private military supply chain. Fragments of Cyrillic code and Chinese-made sensors confirmed what Washington feared. The drug war had crossed into hybrid warfare. Cyber Command raised its alert to DEFCON 3. Treasury froze offshore accounts. Naval intelligence worked with Interpol to seize dual-use cargo. America struck back across every domain: sea, air, and cyberspace. At dawn, a B-2 Spirit traced a corridor over the Yucatan, confirming the Veracruz site was gone. Rails, generators, and bunkers crushed into dust. Marines aboard the USS Tripoli watched in silence. For them, it wasn't revenge. It was closure. Allies quietly praised the precision. NATO called it a new model for modern warfare. Yet intelligence chiefs warned the same tools could arm a rogue state. Inside the Situation Room, one sentence became doctrine: the battlefield is everywhere data moves. By evening, the Gulf was calm again. Destroyers resumed patrol. The Tripoli's radar swept a horizon free of threats. For the United States, Iron Wave proved that even in an age of converging dangers, America could still strike fast, strike clean, and strike back. When the homeland is threatened, the response will be total and uncompromising. Like and subscribe to Military Power. Stay informed, stay ready. See you next time.